Hi again. For those of you who didn't watch the introductory capsule, my name is Patty Cloran. I'm a consultant for autism at the Lester B. Pearson School Board, as well as one of the co-coordinators of the Center of Excellence for Autism. So in part one of our video capsule series, we spoke to you about the lessons that we've learned so far since last March. So what are some of the challenges with remote learning and what are some of the advantages of remote learning? In part two, Katie spoke to us about the implications for teachers, students, paraprofessionals, families. And now in part three, we're going to talk about some of the more practical implications. So how do I set up my classroom? How do I set up schedules? How do I set up my routines? So that's what we're going to look at now. Before we can talk about setting up a weekly schedule or a daily schedule, we need to know what the expectations from the ministry are. And these are going to look a little bit different for remote learning than they did for the physical classroom. And that's because of the distinction between synchronous group learning and asynchronous group learning. In the physical classroom, when we're in schools, our synchronous and asynchronous group learning happens in one space. With online learning, our synchronous learning and asynchronous learning happen in two different ways. So our synchronous group learning happens on platforms like Google Meet or Teams, Zoom, whereas asynchronous learning can happen in many different ways. Maybe there's a Bitmoji classroom, maybe there's a Google Classroom, maybe your students do independent work in different ways. So we need to know how many hours of synchronous group learning is required for whatever cycle we're teaching, how many hours of asynchronous group learning, how often do I need to be available for office hours to answer student questions, and how many subject-specific blocks are required. And this is going to look very different from one cycle to the next. But here's the example of the ministry guidelines for cycle 1 for bilingual instruction. So I have 10.5 hours of synchronous instruction, 3 hours of asynchronous group work, and 2.5 hours of teacher availability. And then on the bottom over here, we have the subject-specific blocks. So with this information, we can now create our weekly schedule. So we can outline the times and the days and how we're going to implement each of those blocks to make sure that we're meeting all of the guidelines. So here's an example of what a weekly visual schedule can look like. So we have the days, the times, but most importantly, if we're going to be sending this out to students and paraprofessionals and parents, the schedule is color-coded. So I know which blocks represent synchronous group learning and asynchronous group learning, recess, lunch, office hours, and for your specific classroom, you would sub out this synchronous time with whatever subject-specific block you're teaching, but your student would be able to identify that that's a synchronous group learning or a class meeting time because it's in blue. So that's an important distinction to make. We're also going to look at some of the things that we want to do and some of the things that we want to avoid when creating weekly visual schedules. So obviously the first thing we want to do is be mindful of the ministry's guidelines. From there, we can make our weekly schedules, and if necessary, depending on the profiles of students that you have in your class and the age of the students that you have in your class, you might want to create daily visual schedules. And this can be provided directly to the student. This can be on the Bitmoji Classroom, on your Google Classroom, whatever platform your students are using or whatever platform you're comfortable using, that's where you would share it. Sometimes we'll hear from teachers or paraprofessionals that a student doesn't need their own daily visual schedule because they know the routine or because even though they have it, they don't really refer to it. And the example that I like to give in that case is, imagine that you were to register for an online conference. When you register for the conference, you kind of look at the schedule, you get a sense of what's happening, and then it comes the day of the conference, but a schedule isn't sent out. And you might find yourself wondering, what time does it start? What time does it end? When are the breaks? When's lunch? You might even be a little bit anxious about that. Maybe you had prior commitments and you're wondering if you're going to be able to, fit both things into your day. Maybe you're feeling particularly tired or irritable that day and you want to know what's expected of you. And we want to offer our students the same courtesy. And that's why we provide visual schedules. I know what my schedule is, and I still refer to it multiple times a day. So even though, I might be able to recite my schedule to you, like a student might be able to recite the schedule to you, I still find comfort in having it visually available to me. And we want to be sharing an updated visual schedule. So if Tuesday's schedule is going to look different than Wednesday's schedule, then do share the updated schedule from one day to the next. And when we share it, it's important to not only share it with the student, but to also be sharing it with the paraprofessional and the student. And this is even more important for remote learning, where the parents are playing a more active role in remote learning, and where our paraprofessionals who we're used to having in the classroom to support the students are no longer in the classroom, but they still need to know when they need to be available to support whatever each specific student. We want to be providing schedules that represent the student's needs. So if your student can derive meaning from words, then that's great. If your student is an emerging reader, then maybe we want to provide a schedule that have words with the pictogram. If your student can derive meaning from clip art or animated pictures, fantastic, but maybe some of your students will need an actual picture of what they're expected to do. So if I were a student and it was time to log on to Zoom, but I couldn't but maybe I'm not familiar with the Zoom icon or the Zoom logo, but I know what Zoom looks like from being on a Zoom session. I know that my peers will be there. I know that my teacher's there. I'm familiar with what that looks like. Then maybe we take a screenshot of a Zoom session, and that's the pictogram for Zoom. And then the student can derive meaning from that and be more autonomous throughout the day. For some students, they can even though they have an individualized schedule, they can mostly parallel what's happening in the group lesson or in the group schedule. Some students are going to need what we call a balanced day schedule. Now, balanced day schedule is when we balance academic demands with the needs of the student. Some of our students are going to need sensory breaks. Some of our students are going to need motor breaks. Some of our students just need a break in the day to make a choice about what they want to do. They need to feel that sense of agency or control over what's happening in their schedule. And all of that is okay, and we can proactively plug that into their day to prevent challenging behavior and to increase availability for learning with synchronous and asynchronous group learning sessions. When possible, we want to embed hyperlinked activities into the schedule. I'll give an example of what this looks like later on. But the idea here is that if we have pictograms or even words on a schedule, we want to make them clickable. So instead of, on the schedule saying math Zoom session and the student has to go, to the Zoom website or to the Zoom app and log in with their credentials, and clickable means that as soon as they click on the icon or on the word, it brings them directly to the activity. So no entering credentials, no remembering usernames and passwords, no finding apps on a computer, less navigation. This is also great for our students who maybe don't have ASD but who have difficulty with executive functioning. This is a way to make remote learning more accessible to them. We also want to color code our visual schedules. This is even more important for remote learning because in remote learning, there's a distinction between synchronous and asynchronous group activities, right? So activities that we're doing together as a class on platforms like Teams or Zoom, and then activities where you're working alone. So work together, work alone. So when we can color code that in the schedule, it becomes a little bit more evident to the student what they're expected to do in addition to having the icon. And it has the added benefit of translating to the group schedule. So when your student has maybe graduated from their individualized daily schedule or balanced day schedule and can, follow the group schedule, well, when the group schedule looks a lot like their individual schedule looked like, that's a much easier transition for them to make. We also, like I mentioned earlier, want to be sharing whatever schedule is going out, be it a weekly schedule, a daily schedule, an individualized schedule, a balanced day schedule. Share it with the paraprofessionals who are working with you in your class. Share it with the parents who are supporting the students who are in your class so that everyone can know when it's their time to step in and when they can step out, student included. So we've spoken about the things that we want to be doing with regard to visual schedules. Now we'll look at some of the things that we want to try to avoid. So if using an individualized daily schedule is one of the things that we want to do, then obviously using a one-size-fits-all schedule is something that we want to avoid. If you have 30 kids in your classroom and 25 of them can follow the group lesson, that's fantastic. But maybe you have a handful of students in your class who need something that's a little bit more tailored or a little bit more individualized to their level of functioning. And so in that case, you want to make sure that we're providing visual schedules to them that they can derive meaning from, that they can be autonomous with. We also want to avoid frequent schedule changes. Now, the exception here is, when we're initially transitioning from from the physical classroom to remote learning, there's going to be a period of adjustment. We're trying to figure out what's working, what doesn't work, how can we adjust the schedule. So there's going to be frequent changes in the initial stages when we're transitioning. But once we're pretty comfortable with remote learning, then we want the schedule to stay as steady as possible. So from week to week or from day to day. We do understand, however, that that's not always possible. Maybe you got called to a department meeting. Maybe you have a parent meeting during the day. Maybe there's just a meeting amongst teachers, or you need to meet with your paraprofessional. So when you have to have a schedule change, then we just want to make sure that we're providing adequate warning to our student and instruction about what they need to be doing during that time. So if we take the example of, usually on, let's say, Thursdays at 1 p.m., there's a synchronous group learning session where we're all meeting together on Google Meet. But this Thursday, you have to attend a parent meeting, and so you're unavailable. So at that time, you plug in an asynchronous activity. And let's say, for instance, that your asynchronous activity is a Boom card. Well, we want to give our student a heads up that that's going to be happening, but we also want to make sure that they know how to use Boom cards. Have they ever done it before? Do they know what that looks like? Do they know how to complete it? Do they know how to submit it? All of those things are going to be important. It's going to make the student feel a little bit more successful with the schedule change. And we also want to advise the paraprofessional that that's going to be happening as well. When possible, we want to keep the schedule template as similar from one day to the next as possible. There's a really easy way to do this. Once you decide on a schedule template that works for you, that works for your class, that works for a specific student, then you can save it in Word or in PowerPoint as a master copy. And once it's saved as a master copy, it'll kind of be set in stone in that way, and you can create new daily schedules where the template remains the same and all you need to do is edit the activities from one day to the next. So you don't have to recreate it every day. It's there, it's ready to go. All you need to do is input the activities. We also want our schedules to be as self-evident as possible. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. If your student is an emerging reader, but has not quite consolidated the skill of reading, then we want to make sure that we're not only putting words in their visual schedule. They're going to need the word and the pictogram. Same thing goes for a student who maybe isn't at the reading level at all yet. Then we don't want to be putting in just words for them either. We want to have pictograms that are meaningful for them, that they can derive meaning out of. The schedule that we're making available for our student really isn't for us. We know what the schedule is. Our paraprofessionals, if we've sent them the schedule, they know what the schedule is. The schedule that we're sending out is really for the student, for them to feel like they have predictability in their day. They know what's going to happen. That reduces anxiety. They feel a little bit more autonomous because they can function on their own. They don't always need somebody to come and intervene and tell them where to go and what to do. So that's really, really important when considering which type of schedules is going to be appropriate for the different profiles in your classroom. This is an example of a daily schedule. Now, it doesn't have to look like this. Again, depending on the students that you have in your class, maybe you'll have words, maybe you'll have words and pictures. Maybe you'll want to use something that looks completely different from this, and all of that is okay. We just want to make sure, as we spoke about, that the schedule is that the student can derive meaning from their schedule. So what I like about this is that, let's say I was the student and I were to go over here and click on this image. By clicking on that, it would bring me directly to my group learning, right? So blue, as we learned from our weekly schedule, means a synchronous group learning meeting. So I click on the schedule, it brings me directly to my group meeting. I don't have to input any credentials. I don't have to open an app. I don't have to go to a website. It's as easy as that. So that's one of the things that we want to try to do as much as possible, especially for our earlier learners, is to avoid the multiple steps that can be involved in accessing remote learning. The other thing that we want to do is be mindful of the type of activities that we assign for asynchronous learning. So we want to try as much as possible to assign closed-ended activities. So if we were in a physical classroom, a closed-ended activity might be something like a puzzle where we put in the pieces and it's very clear when the puzzle is done. I know I'm done this activity because the picture is complete. Or another example of a closed-ended activity could be a worksheet where once I've completed the worksheet, I know that I'm done that activity. And those are great activities for our students with ASD because there's not a lot of ambiguity. It's very clear what needs to be done, where's the beginning, where the end is. We want to try to avoid activities that are open-ended or activities where it's difficult to monitor completion. So if I were a teacher and I assigned to my students to read chapter 4 of their science books, well, how do I monitor completion of the activity? How do I know that my student actually understood what they read? That's a little bit more tricky. So here I gave the example of boom cards, which we spoke about earlier as well, but boom cards are a great activity because they have a clear beginning, a clear end. The teacher gets direct feedback. So as soon as the student presses submit, it's a one-click submission. As soon as the student presses submit, the teacher gets feedback about the student's progress, what they got right, what they didn't get right. And so it's really clear to the student and to the teacher how that all went down and how that happened. The other thing that I really like about this schedule is the self-monitoring component. And so in the physical classroom, what you might be used to seeing is a to-do column and a done column. And when the student has completed an activity, they move their pictogram over from the to-do to the done column, and that's how they monitor completion of their activity and progress throughout the day. So in this schedule, we have the option to just kind of click as soon as you're done an activity, it checks it off, and the student knows that that is done. In some cases, you might have some students for whom self-monitoring isn't a realistic expectation at this point in time, and that's okay. You can still leave the self-monitoring component, but have the parent or paraprofessional model how to complete that. So model self-monitoring. And this, in time, the student might be able to do it on their own, and that's a great executive functioning skill, right? Concept of time and space, organization, and that's something that they'll be able to do down the road and carry with them as a functional life skill. So this wraps up part 3 of schedules and routines in remote learning. In part 4 of the video capsule series, we'll talk about tips for synchronous group learning. And in part 5, we'll look at tips for asynchronous group learning. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you found this helpful.